Last week, we introduced this year's Christmas series, and that series is called Breaking the Silence. And one of the things that we learned is that God reveals himself in the silence. Whether it's our own personal silence or whether it's the silence that the world sees and feels, God breaks the silence. And when he breaks that silence, things happen. People change, events line up to fit God's plan and purpose for his purpose. When God breaks the silence in your lives, you change. And when you change, the people around you change. And when they change, the events and things around them change. When God breaks the silence. When we talked about this, I gave you two examples from the Bible. The first example I gave you is from 1 Samuel. I encouraged you to read the whole book. I specifically encouraged you to read the first 3 chapters of 1 Samuel. In that 3rd chapter, the first verse, it starts out like this. In that day, the word of the Lord was rare, and there was no widespread revelation. That's another way of saying that people thought back then in that day that God was silent. And when it says that there was no widespread revelation, that means that there was no word of God going forth. That means that there was no understanding about what God was doing. That means that the people were wandering around and thinking, is there really ever a God in my life, any place? Is there really God? And I told you that when there is no revelation of God, people run amok. That's what they do. They're just left to their own designs, and that's what they do. They just make their own choices with no regard for anybody but themselves. And when that happens, we're in trouble. It was at that time that Samuel was sleeping, and God spoke to him. And when Samuel realized that God was speaking, and God began to speak to him, you know what? He changed. And when he changed, the nation of Israel began to change. When God breaks through your silence, things happen. You and the people around you begin to change. Never, ever, ever, never think that your prayers don't count. Never, ever, ever, never think that God doesn't hear what you're saying. And today I will even tell you, don't ever believe that God's not speaking. That's not the issue. He is speaking. He's always speaking. I gave you another example, and that example is Elijah. It comes from 1 Kings chapters 18 and 19. And Elijah literally had a mountaintop experience. And after that mountaintop experience, he gets a note from the queen. And the queen says, I'm going to kill you. And that threw him into a tizzy. He didn't know what to do, so he ran because he was full of fear, thinking that this queen was going to kill him. And as he was running, in my mind, I'm thinking that he was just pretty mad at God because what he had done up on that other mountain was miraculous, as God walked through him and lived through him and caused some miraculous things to take place. He was God's man of power for that day and time and that hour. And then all of a sudden this queen says she's going to kill him. And as he's running, he's trying to talk to God about that because he's mad. He's saying, I just did everything you wanted me to do. And now you're going to kill me. What's up with that? Why can you do that? Why are you going to do that? That does not make any sense to me, God. That's probably what he was doing. And you know what? There was silence. God didn't say anything to him. He got so tired of running, he fell asleep. He woke up. The angel had prepared some food for him. He ran another 40 days. He came to another mountain. He goes into a cave to hide. And God comes to him and said, I want you to come out here and we're going to have a chat. So he said, okay. And then he hears the rocks start coming together. And he said, you know what? I mean, there was a big noise, just crashing and all that kind of stuff. He said, God's not in that. Mighty wind came up. More crashing and things breaking and rocks falling. And you know what? He said, you know what? God's not in that. Big blazing fire came up, and he could hear things burning and the snapping and the popping of the wood as it burned. And you know what? He said, God's not in that. And then in a still, quiet voice, God said, Elijah, I want to speak to you. And he said, that's God. So he got himself up and he covered his face. That's a sign of reverence. That's a sign of respect. And he went out and he talked with God. God broke his silence. And when he did, Elijah changed. The northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of Israel changed. A young man by Elijah, SHA, changed because God came and broke through the silence. God's not silent anymore, guys. God is always speaking. The New Testament comes on the heels of a 400-year intermission to the biblical narrative. It's a time when God was seemingly silent. From the time the last book in the Old Testament was written to the time the first book in the New Testament was written, 400 years of silence took place. And in this new scene, a new character is introduced. Well, really, it's not a new character. It's an old character. But just in a different way. That character is Jesus. And when Jesus came, he started breaking through the silence. He came into the world and instantly he began changing the lives of people even before he was born. And his impact has changed and continues to change the world. So today, we are going to hear about the response of the wise men. When God broke the silence by sending Jesus, one of the people that were affected by that was the wise man. And my hope is that your response, my response, our response will be the same as the wise men's response.
God had been silent for over 400 years. We knew because we had been listening. Well, listening and you sense. You see, my job was to look and to listen. See, people who talk a lot, you don't call them wise, do you? No. So we have other names for those type of people. And wise is not one of them. In my position, I looked everywhere. And watch the stars. And we would read. And we'd try to interpret what they were telling us. And then I read of a star. A star that would announce a new king. And then, out of nowhere, that star, it appeared. And that star was different. Because it was like a beacon in the night. And after watching it for a while, and after reading, I felt it was the stars that the Jews had been looking for. It was foretold in their ancient scriptures. The star of a new king, the Messiah. And so, I decided to follow it. Well, we decided to follow it. And as we walked, we journaled. It was so bizarre. The star led us. And we would follow. And eventually, it led us to Jerusalem. And that's where we found a man by the name of King Herod. He claimed he wanted to worship the Messiah too. So he asked us. No, he demanded that once we found a newborn king, we would come back so that he could worship too. But that night in a dream, we were warned by the Lord not to return. So for over 2 years, we journeyed, with the star guiding us all the way. And then it stopped. It stopped in Judea in a town called Bethlehem. It stopped not over a house, but the house of a peasant. Our 2-year journey to see a new king led us not to a palace, but the house of a peasant. And that was it. We gathered our thoughts. And we did what we could to contain our emotions. We took our gifts. And behind those doors, we found a new king. The King of the Jews. Emmanuel. God with us. Could it be the Messiah? God with us? Come to save the Jews and the Gentiles? So as we came before him, we took our gifts and we kneeled for the King. We placed our gifts at his feet. Yes. Yes, God has spoken. And we must worship.
"400 years of silence. And then God speaks by sending Jesus. when you read Matthew 2, which is the only biblical description that we have of the wise men, I wonder to myself, after 400 years of silence to your people, God, 400 years, you allow some heathens to know and hear you speak before your people respond? And I'm thinking to myself as I'm reading this story, what's up with that? What were you thinking, God? Why them? The wise men, they were from the east. If you read Matthew, the 2nd chapter, it says, wise men came from the east. If you look through the Bible, you'll not hear them talk about the Israelites as wise men. That's not the words that they use. These guys were not Jewish rabbis. They were not Jewish priests. They had not been born from one of the 12 tribes of Israel. But yet, when God breaks the silence, it's these foreigners that hear and act on what they've seen and heard. And I say to myself, God, what's up with that? That's not fair. That's not right. And then after I calm down from that, then I begin to say, well, God, why did that happen that way? Because you see, these wise men, they were foreigners. The word that's used for wise men there, that word is used in the early translations of the Bible. It means sorcerer, magician. It means astrologist, astronomer. That doesn't sound like a child of God to me. And I'm thinking to myself, why did they hear and come and see the newborn king? One of the things I realized from this story is that they were coming because they did hear and see. They were listening and watching. They were willing to be led, and they were willing to follow. I'm thinking of the Christmas carol, "Do You Hear What I Hear?" In the first stanza, it has this phrase, "Do you see what I see?" In the second stanza, it has this phrase, "Do you hear what I hear?" And finally, in the third stanza, it says, "Do you know what I know?" So then I said, well, God, this star, it was in the sky. Everybody in the world can look up and see the stars. Did they see the children of God? Did they see what the wise men seen? Yeah. Did they hear what the wise men heard? Well, yeah, as the wise men said, you know what? They had their scriptures, and the scriptures are the one that pointed to there's a star that's going to tell you that my son, who is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, will be born. They knew that. Well, how do you know that they knew, Phil? Because when the wise men went to Herod, Herod said, I didn't know anything about this. Why are you here? And so it troubled him, and he went to his buddies, some of the scribes and the priests of the Jews, and I don't get the impression that they hesitated. They did not say, you know what, why don't you let me write this note down and I'll go back and do some research back in the archives. They didn't say that. They didn't say, why don't you send me an email about that? And I'll look at that up and I'll send you an email back. They didn't say, you know what, give me a week, let's set a meeting, and we'll get together and discuss that. I don't get the impression that that's what took place. By reading the scriptures, it seems like what took place is Herod went to somebody, and that somebody or those somebody said, oh yeah, we know exactly what you're talking about. He's supposed to be born over there in Bethlehem. I'm thinking, duh. Why didn't you go? Well, Herod didn't care, so Herod just came back and said, when you find him, come tell me, so that I may go and worship him too. They had a sign. They knew that he was going to be born. They were able to read that in the scriptures. They were able to see that there was something different in the sky. They didn't do anything. You know what we call those things today? We call those things signs. How many of you have ever gone to Omaha and the interstate before? I have made that trip too. And when I've made that trip, I'll see a sign. And that sign will say, Omaha, 40 miles. Omaha, 22 miles. You know what? In all of my days of going back and forth from Lincoln to Omaha, I have never pulled off the road and stopped at that sign and said, oh, Omaha, 40 miles. I've seen the sign. I think I'll just lay my sleeping bag out right here and stay. That's ridiculous. You don't stop because you see the sign. What does the sign do? It points you to where you're going. You know you're on the right trail. So what do? You keep going until you get there. What did the Jews do? Oh. And that was it. They just went about life like it was an everyday thing. When the wise men who had come into town, and I would imagine that there was something different about them because they were not from there. They were not from the north. They were not from the south. They were from the east. And Israel doesn't talk about people coming from the east. So they had to be different. And so they came into town. And if there were a lot, I mean, we really don't know. But if there were a lot, then people were looking at them. You guys sure are different. You need to go down to the clothing store or something. You don't smell right. Get some deodorant. You know what? They were different. I don't know how you missed that. And then I imagine that after they heard from Herod, they're looking at themselves when they're getting ready to fall asleep that night and they're saying, did we miss it? Have we spent the last 2 years of our life on this journey and we have missed it? Because nobody around here seems to know anything. Nobody seems to care. What were we doing? Does anybody know? Or did we waste 2 years of our life? Have you ever felt like that? In your walk with the Lord and you're seeing all these other people live however it is that they want to live, do whatever it is they want to do, and it seems to me like they're getting away with it. And do you ever say to yourself, what about me, God? What happens to me? Why can't I win a sweepstakes? Well, that's a whole nother sermon. But if you do, come to me. When they left that city, all the news channels didn't say, we got to get the scoop. They're leaving. They look like they figured something out. Maybe there really is a Messiah. Let's go get the scoop. There was none of that. Nobody followed them. They went out and nobody cared. The wise men heard God breaking through the silence because they watched and listened. Because they were willing to be led, and because they followed. They didn't stop at the sign. If we want to be like the wise men, then that's what we need to do. Watch and listen, or look and listen, or we need to be willing to be led. We need to follow. The biblical word for obey, I'm not going to even try and pronounce it because I'll just mess it up. But the biblical word for obey literally means under hearing. And it's translated as to listen attentively. One of the things I like about Pastor Sean's sermons, his messages, is that he gives some downright brilliant and wonderful illustrations and stories that really emphasize his point. And when he does that, sometimes I'm looking around at you all. Sometimes you're looking back at me. But I'm looking around at you all. And when I look around at you, I see you. Let's see here. This is what I see you doing. I hope I don't mess things up. I see you sitting, and as you're sitting, you begin to narrow your focus. And as you narrow your focus, you kind of lean forward sometimes. And then as you're beginning to see something that you recognize of yourself in his, so I know who you are. As you see something, as you're beginning to recognize something in his story that resembles you, you just kind of narrow your eyes and you begin to shake your head a little bit. And some of you, you just stand and you're not standing, you're sitting and you just look and you're like just leaning in. That means that you're attentive and that you're listening. Sometimes when I'm listening, I'll listen and I'll lean more and more, and then sometimes I'll do this. And I'll put my hands over my mouth because I don't want to say anything. I don't want to interrupt what's being said, and I don't want to lose what I'm hearing. So I will cover up my mouth so I won't say anything. I should probably do that more often. That's listening and being attentive. That's what the wise men were doing. The Latin word for hearing is audire. And it's the root word that we use from our English language. It's the root word for obedience. Obedience. So what that means is to obey God is to hear him speak. When the wise men said that it was his job to listen and to look, he is literally saying that if he listens, he will hear. And when he hears, he will obey or he will act on what he's heard. If you think God is silent in your life, if you're not hearing his voice, then maybe it's because you're not willing to do what he's asking you to do. And someplace on the inside of you, you've made that choice, whether you realize it or not. When I was growing up and involved in church life, I would hear people say, you know what, I don't feel like God's speaking to me anymore. I don't feel like God is talking to me. What should I do? And the people that they would ask that of, they would say, well, what's the last thing that God said to you? And they would think, and they would say, well, this and this and this. And then they say, well, then you go do that. And then let's see what happens. Well, I always thought that they meant that they needed to do something and then God would speak to them. But I didn't understand that God was speaking, but because they were not acting on what he said, they weren't hearing what he was saying. If you feel like God is silent in your life right now, if you're having a hard time getting direction for your life, or you're saying, God, I don't know what you want me to do, where you want me to go, I don't know what to do here, I don't know how I'm going to make it because I can't hear your voice, you say to God in the sincerity of your heart, God, if you speak, I'll listen. And when you say that you're listening, you're saying that you'll be obedient. And you're saying that, yeah, I'll do what you tell me to do. And you will hear him speak. He may speak in a variety of ways. He could speak through circumstances. He could speak through a song. He could speak through another person. Do you know what? He could even speak through somebody that don't even think like you. That don't even believe like you. This is an amazing thing that these, and I'm not trying to be unkind to them, but these heathens, the wise men, heathen means somebody that doesn't know God. These heathens heard God. And they acted on what they heard and seen. They didn't stop with the sign. They followed the sign all the way to the end. If we want to break the silence in our life, then we need to do what the wise men did. We need to listen and watch. Because the problem is God speaking. That's not the question. That's not the problem. The question is, are we listening? Are we watching? And are we willing to act on what he says? When we act on what he says, we call that obedience. The wise men followed the star. When the star moved, they moved. Where the star went, they went. The wise men were willing to follow God. If you're going to be a wise man, you'll have to follow God. There's a Christian songwriter, a prolific Christian songwriter today, Chris Tomlin. There's many of them, but I'm thinking of Chris Tomlin. And he wrote a song called I Will Follow. And some of the lyrics go like this. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. When you move, I'll move. I will follow. If I could sing, I'd sing it for you, but then the place would empty out. All your ways are good. All your ways are sure. I will trust in you alone. Higher than my sight, high above my life, I will trust in you alone. Who you love, I will love. How you serve, I will serve. If this life I lose, I will still follow you. I will follow you. You are the light unto the world. You are the light in my life. I will live for you alone. You are the one that I seek because I know that I will find all I need in you alone. If there is everlasting freedom, or you will give me everlasting freedom from my soul, you will give me joy, unending joy. And so I will follow you. That sounds like what the wise men did. They made a decision, they made a choice to follow Jesus, or to follow the star, So then I ask you the question, are you willing to follow Jesus the way the wise men followed the star? The wise men said, you know, it was weird. The star would lead, it would move, and we would follow it. And then it stopped. If we are going to be like the wise men, then we must be willing to follow God's lead. Have you ever seen two people dance and both of them are trying to lead? Those people don't get on DWTS. Did you know that? Because they are not going to win. You cannot have two leaders when you're dancing. If we are going to dance with God, we have to let him lead. I like that. If we're going to dance with God, we have to let him lead. Jamie Grace, another Christian singer-writer, she has written a song. It's called You Lead, and it captures this principle. You lead, I will follow. Your hands hold my tomorrow. Your grip, your grace, you know the way. You guide me tenderly. When you lead, I will follow. Just like the way, and I'll go. 'Cause I know what you got for me is more than I can see. So lead me on. Just lead me on. There is no other way for me. I am devoted to you. You are my peace on the heavy days. You are the warmth of an autumn blaze. Your love carries me away. This world may push, it may pull, but your mercy never fails. You lead, and I'll follow. Sounds like the wise men, doesn't it? Sounds like what they did. The end result of the wise men journey was this, is that they did find what, not so much what, but who they were looking for. Because they were looking for a who, and the what came with it. What came with them finding Jesus? Peace. Peace. It was a 2-year journey. And you know what? That 2-year journey did not happen overnight. They didn't have a little genie in some kind of a lamp and rub it and say, okay, put us 2 years in the future and we'll end up in Jerusalem. No, they didn't do that. They had to walk out that step every day of that 2 years. It was a journey, and that's the way life is like. It's a journey. And then at the last turn, at the last corner, they had to make another choice, another decision. When they are standing in front of that house, that humble abode, when they are standing there, they are in a small town, not even a town, a village. Bethlehem was not that big. It was a little village. And they were there in front of this little dwelling. And they had been in the king's palace in Jerusalem. They had been in Jerusalem. And they're thinking, really, we're going to find what we want here? And they had to make a decision. And they had to make a choice. Are we going to continue to walk by faith? Or are we going to walk by sight? The Bible tells us, it starts off in the Old Testament in Habakkuk, and it goes 3 times in the New Testament, that the just shall live. Live also means to walk by faith and not by sight. And what they had in front of them was not any evidence or any proof of a king. But you know what they did? They knocked on the door, and they went in, and that thing that caused them to follow the sign, the star that they had seen, it was down here, and it just came up within them and filled their heart and filled their head, and they knew that they were in the right place. They knew that this was the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And their response to that, once they found what they were looking for and who they were looking for, their response to that was to bow down and worship. And then they offered their gifts. And you know what? Their gifts were merely an extension of themselves. They offered that baby their life. That was their response. When God speaks, someplace in that, you are going to have to make a decision or a choice. Am I going to follow me and my own wants and desires? Or am I going to follow him? And the step of faith and the proof that you're going to follow him comes when you begin to worship him. When you begin to bow down and say, yes, Lord, I will follow you. I will worship you. And then they gave gifts. You have gifts and talents and abilities. Are you giving those things to God? Back when we talked about Samuel and we went through that story, I like the way the Bible puts it. It says that Hannah, his mother, lent him unto the Lord. She gave him to the Lord. Are you giving yourselves to God? If you're not hearing his voice, maybe that's why. If we want to be wise men, I'm going to ask the worship team to come up. If we are not hearing his voice, maybe it's because we're not worshiping him. And worship is a sign of faith, and putting our faith and trust and hope in God. If we want to be like the wise men, we must look and listen. We must look for the signs. And then we have to follow the signs. And we have to be willing to be led by the signs. And if we're doing those things, we are going to come to a point where we have to say, God, I choose you over me. And when we do that, and we bow down before him and we say, Father, thank you. What is yours, and I am yours. And I will give you all of myself. I will be who you want me to be. I will do what you want me to do. Where you go, I will go. Who you love, I will love. Where you serve, I will serve. I will follow you. You lead, and I will follow. I'm going to ask you to stand.